Let's start with Zelensky is coming this Friday to the US,
Mm,
presumably to sign a deal with Trump. I mean, we knew that eventually he would sign it. My
yeah.
understanding, based on my reading, is that the US is going to give some kind of vague security guarantee. What's your take? What do you
Well,
expect?
this is it. The Financial Times says that there's no security guarantee contained in the document. They
Okay.
say that it's a framework agreement, which is incredibly vague and in which none of the details have actually been sorted out. The Ukrainians say that they want security guarantees. They're not being very clear about whom they want them from. This is my own take on this. It's very much like what the Ukrainians tried to do with the Russians, in fact, did do with the Russians in April 2022, which is they come along, they present the Americans with a draft agreement. The draft agreement, by the way, apparently makes it clear that no money is actually going to go to the United States until all the details are ironed out. And then what the Ukrainians are going to try and do is that they're going to involve the Americans in a long discussion going on for months and weeks and whatever it is, and try to get the Americans to agree to security guarantees. So that is my best take on this so far. We've not yet seen the document.
Mhm.
It's not even absolutely certain that Zelensky is indeed traveling to
Mhm.
Washington on Friday. I mean, um, the Financial Times report, which broke all of this, said that he's going to come in the next few weeks. But then Trump says he's coming on Friday. We'll just have to wait and see what this amounts to. But in my opinion, it's all fantasy. I mean, the United States isn't going to get any money. And whatever the Americans say, they're not going to provide any real security guarantees. I think that this is just each side trying to trick the other, actually.
And here's the thing. First of all, why would anybody trust the United States at this point? Why would Zelensky and the Ukrainian government? It's not just Zelensky. I mean, nobody in his own circle is saying we're done here. I mean, why are we continue to believe in the Americans? They
That That is an excellent question, actually. I mean, it makes no sense at all. I mean, the reason they are going through this performance is because they don't want to end the war with Russia. They don't want to negotiate. They don't want to sit down with the Russians and negotiate. They want the war to go on. And they know perfectly well that without the Americans, they can't continue the war. So this is what this is all about. So it's a game that the Americans and the Ukrainians are playing with each other. And the Ukrainian objective is to try to get the Americans to recommit to some kind of defense in Ukraine, to get us back to the position that they had with the Biden people. So that's really what this is about. But you're quite right. I mean, logically, they shouldn't trust the Americans, and it's important to say that though apparently the Ukrainian parliament is expected to ratify this deal, there's no chance at all that the Senate will. So there we are. Apparently, the Trump people are not even proposing to put it before the Senate.
okay. Well, everybody is putting up a show then.
Mm. It's a show. I mean, we shouldn't blind ourselves to what this is. And I know, again, people in China
Mhm.
are very familiar with this phrase. This is what is called an unequal treaty.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
that what this is what this is intended to be. I mean, you get resource extraction. Notice, and Trump made this very clear again in another post on Truth Social. The Americans are going to extract money from Ukraine not in return for future support, but in return for what they say is
Mhm.
the funding and the support they have already given. And as far as I can make out, this is open ended.
Mhm.
So people who say that Ukraine has somehow benefited because it's no longer limited to $500 billion are deceiving themselves. I mean, in place of that figure, which is admittedly monstrous and absolutely huge, which Ukraine could never possibly pay. We're now going to have a no limit pay. So Ukraine will be permanently tied to the United States, giving up half their income from the minerals that they supposedly have, but probably don't have, to the Americans, and it'll be there indefinitely. So this is a very bad deal. It's not a good deal at all.
Yeah, before we go to this, in unequal treaty, me as American, I'm also interested. And when Trump said half of the mineral rights to go to the United States, who are the United States? Is it the U.S. government or the U.S. private companies? I don't think I would see a dime out of it. I don't think.
That is an excellent question, by the way. That is a very, very good question. I mean, there's supposed to be some kind of fund created, and the money will go into this fund, and then it will be divided equally between the two. But who are the two? I don't know. I don't think anybody yet does. I mean, this thing has been put together at warp speed, and I don't think anything here has been ironed up. You're absolutely right. I mean, if the American private companies want to go to Ukraine, then can sign licenses to develop Ukraine's mineral wealth, what prevents them? The Ukrainians would probably agree to that. But logically, this agreement, one would think, would mean that the money would go to the United States itself. But how is that going to work exactly? I mean, nobody's explained it. Nobody's even looked into this.
Yeah, it sounds like a grand deal, but it seems to me like Ukraine will get nothing, lose everything.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, and then here is also just like 5 minutes before I started this program with you, I just read that Independent, said that the real reason Trump wants Ukrainians minerals, why is it all about China? You see, so it's all about China.
It always is. It always is. Yeah.
Here's the thing, though. According to this article, they're saying ever since China banned some minerals like gallium and germanium, so for that reason, now Trump wants the gallium, I guess, the gallium and the germanium from Ukraine. But my understanding, I have very limited understanding of this, is that ever since China have control over these rare minerals, there are plenty of countries claim they have those, resources. I think Vietnam said that, Mongolia said that, and of course Ukrainian also. The problem is not even the U.S. Certain parts of the U.S. has rare minerals. So the problem to me, it's not the minerals itself, in the natural form, but it's the smelting, the processing. That's where China has advantage, isn't it?
This is absolutely correct. In fact, I can say that definitively because I've discussed it with the relevant people. These so-called rare earths, as earths, are not rare. They are found in many, many places, including in the United States itself. Of course, Russia has abundant resources of these, as Putin is talking about, but they can find them in all kinds of places. The problem is extracting and refining these materials is difficult and very expensive. Now, China, which does industrial planning, which the United States doesn't do, set up a program going all the way back to the 1990s to actually do that. So, I mean, they worked very hard. They worked out how to do it, and they've done it. And they do this on an industrial scale, and they do this very successfully. The United States did this up to a point, up to the early 1990s, and then stopped doing it. Guess why? Because it was cheaper to import these things from China. That's the whole story behind this.
Well, what's the next step then? So is U.S. going to negotiate with Russia? It seems to me that they're going to giving Russian everything. Is it?
Right. I think this is as absolutely fantastic a thing as this whole deal with Ukraine. I mean, obviously the Russians have vast resources of these things. Putin has just had a long meeting in Moscow in which he's talked about the importance for Russia as a sovereign country to ensure sovereign security by developing its own processing of these materials. So what the Russians do is, they're aware that the Ukrainians are coming up with these fancy offers to Trump. And they say to Trump, well, look, why are you wasting your time with these losers? We've got this far more than the Ukrainians do. I mean, if you really wanted to be serious about this, you should be speaking to us, not to them. We can do it far better. The reality is not a single rare earth is going to be sent from Moscow, from Russia to the United States. We're not going to see any factories or plants opening up there. Putin is talking about, getting the aluminium forge in Krasnoyarsk operating again, and how the Americans might be involved in doing that. The Americans are not going to be involved in doing that. If anybody outside Russia is involved, it would be China. I can tell you this absolutely. It's not going to happen, because whenever there have been attempts to try to establish a proper commercial trading relationship between Russia and China, and the United States, politics has always got in the way. That is how it has always been, and that is how it always will be, and the Russians know it.
Yeah, it's a very difficult. I mean, Putin even said that during his interview with Tucker Carlson, right? That the president comes and goes, but then, just things doesn't get, maybe things that have been promised and then unpromised, and claimed and then unclaimed. It just always like that. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I can remember a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, Exxon did a big deal with the Russians to develop oil in the Arctic. And there was a lot of surprise at the time, because it was expected that the Russians would give the bid to a Chinese company, but they went with Exxon, which did have more experience of doing this sort of thing. Well, within about a couple of years, that whole deal fell apart because of all the sanctions and all of that. And the word I've heard is that there is no desire on the part of American companies to return to Russia at the present time, because they consider the whole situation there too unstable. I mean, the whole trading relationship too unstable. The Russians know it.
And also, one more thing is nobody talk about is how about Nordstream? If I were Russian, I would put that into the negotiation as well, because it seems to me Russia now has the upper hand, because it is the United States who wants the conflict to end. Russia is fine. Russia is doing well in the front. So what about the Nordstream?
Well, that's a very good question as well. I mean, bear something in mind. And I remember that Putin had a discussion about this with Olaf Scholz right at the start of the conflict. He said, look, if you close down Nord Stream, and this is before it was blown up, if you close it down, we've got all of this gas. It can't just remain, circling around. What we're going to do is we are going to use some of that gas for our own domestic heating, and other parts of it we will export to China, in effect. So if you take this off, if you stop this, then over time the ability to get that pipeline gas moving again isn't going to rise. It's just not going to happen. So yes, I think the Russians probably will want to know what the truth about Nord Stream is. I think the Americans, by the way, should also want to know. I mean, if it was Biden who ordered it, then of course that plays directly into Trump's hands, because he's got Biden authorizing a terrorist act, to say it bluntly. If it was the Ukrainians, well, again, that could play into his hands too. He could use that in all sorts of ways. So I think a proper investigation into what happened in Nord Stream serves everybody's interests. And I would not be at all surprised if the Russians do bring it up over the course of their discussions with the Americans. But I don't myself expect the gas relationship between Russia and Europe to return to what it was before the war.
Honestly, with the United States, even maybe, quite possibly, it's Biden who ordered it, but it's possible that the US will blame the Norwegians or the Danish and blame on them. No. And maybe even possible ask them to pay something to Russia. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly.
No, I wouldn't be at all surprised, and I suspect the British probably had a hand in it too. I'm pretty sure that the authorities in London know the whole story about it, and were probably briefed about it in advance.
And then the whole thing. How about the Europeans? What is the European going to do? I mean, so far they get nothing, right? And what are they
Yeah.
going to do continuing?
Well, this is it, because the Europeans are very upset and very angry that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other.
Mhm.
They're even more angry that the Americans and the Russians voted on the same side in the United Nations yesterday. And China, by the way, voted alongside the Americans and the Russians as well. And the Chinese foreign ministry was very careful to point out they weren't siding with Russia or America here. They were simply consistent with their long-term policies, which is to promote peace. Well, the Europeans are furious. They are deeply upset that they're not involved in the discussions between the Americans and the Russians.
Mhm.
But they're not coming up with anything constructive of their own. They're not proposing their own way forward. They're talking about peacekeepers, but the Russians have already said they won't accept peacekeepers from Britain and France. And besides, this presumes a ceasefire, which hasn't even been negotiated yet. So this is far too far ahead of where we are at the present time. So they show no real plan about what they want to do. They're not proposing any ideas about how the war would end. They're not speaking to the Russians, which they're perfectly at liberty to do. They don't like the fact the Americans are talking to the Russians. As the Russians have pointed out, well, what prevents them in that case from talking to the Russians themselves? But they're not doing it. They're just continuing to shout and yell and scream from the sidelines, even as the Americans and the Russians start talking to each other. But they are completely without ideas.
Well, Macron was in the White House recently,
Mm,
and it sounds to me like he wants to hold on to this 300 billion Russian asset. He
yeah.
doesn't want to give it back to Russia, right? Or unfreeze it. Is that what the Europeans want? They
Absolutely. They've convinced themselves that this gives them leverage over the Russians. All it does is annoy the Russians. The Russians don't need that money, but as far as they're concerned, it's theirs. And again, I think the Europeans think they can trade it for something. The Russians are not going to trade it for anything. That's my own take of it. That's the mood in Moscow at the moment. And I think this is something that in Europe they don't understand.
And one more thing he also said that got a lot of attention in China is he also said Washington's priority is to put a tariff on China.
Yeah.
How pathetic is that? So he's saying you shouldn't, put tariff on us, but focusing on China. And China was like, I mean, there were lots of people gaffe in the social media. What
Yeah.
is your take on that?
Well, this is the same Macron who a year ago was going off to Beijing, saying, having these wonderful meetings with Xi Jinping, saying what a wonderful place China was, what a wonderful leader Xi Jinping was, how we should develop this great relationship with China. And now he's turning around and in front of Trump, he says a completely different story. You're absolutely right. It is absolutely pathetic. France has worked very hard over many, many years to develop a good relationship with China. And here we see that its own president is, well, he's throwing it all away in order to try to flatter Trump,
Mhm.
in order to get Trump to recommit to Ukraine. I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, it's absurd, actually. I mean, it's not diplomacy. It's not serious people. There's an article in the Daily Telegraph which said that this is trickery, which is exactly what it is. It's trying to trick Trump into doing some things by telling him things that he wants to hear and not paying any attention to what the Chinese think. The Chinese must be looking at all of this and they must be saying to themselves, these people are fools, which they
Yeah,
are, of course.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems to me he ran out of option. Other than the only thing he can do now is to badmouth China. It's just
Yeah, yeah,
so incredible. Yeah.
yes.
Now let's look at the. I do want to talk to you about some history. There's a lot of parallels, right? One thing lots of the Chinese netizens discussed is first the Munich Agreement in 1938,
Mm,
where the Czechoslovakia was not at the table when
mm,
Germany and France, Britain, right? They were negotiating Switzerland, right?
Yeah,
Which is part of Czechoslovakia, but
yeah,
Czechoslovakia was not even at the table, isn't it? What
yes.
was that whole thing? If
Yeah, it is absolutely correct. I mean, this is part of the so-called policy of appeasement. Now, I think the first thing to understand about what happened in 1938 is that Nazi Germany, Hitler, wanted war. I mean, he wanted war, and he was looking for reasons to start a war. So he wanted to start a war by creating issues over the treatment of German minorities in Czechoslovakia. And he stirred up the problems in Czechoslovakia and used that as an excuse to threaten Czechoslovakia. And the British and the French realized that Hitler wanted a war against Czechoslovakia. They were also aware that Czechoslovakia was an ally of the Soviet Union, which it was, and they didn't like that at all. The British and the French didn't want to fight Germany at that time, didn't want to fight Nazi Germany at that time. So they did a deal directly with Hitler in which they carved up Czechoslovakia. And that was absolutely awful. That was a horrible deal. It is not what is going on between the Americans and the Russians at the moment. It's very different, because what the Americans and the Russians are talking about at the present time is about steps to improve their relations. They're meeting tomorrow again in Istanbul to try to get their embassies. I mean, the Russian embassy in America doesn't function. The American embassy in Moscow doesn't function. They want to sort out the problems with their embassies. They want to move towards a process of normalization. But if you look at all the statements that all of them have made, the Americans especially, the plan there is to try to get negotiations between Russia and Ukraine underway. So people who say that Ukraine is being excluded are wrong. By the way, and for the record, starting in August 2023 and continuing right up to a meeting that took place last year in Switzerland, there were a series of meetings which the Western powers organized, which was supposed to work towards a peace in Ukraine. The Western powers and Ukraine organized, from which Russia was excluded. It's very strange how people have completely forgotten all about this. But the only people who were trying to exclude anybody from the substantive negotiations as to how to bring about peace were the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Biden administration.
Yeah. And there's more discussions in China about the Paris Peace Conference, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed.
Yeah.
Because that is, of course, after World War One, they
Yeah.
were deciding how to punish Germany. But
Yeah.
in the process, they didn't really return what Germany took from China back to China. They gave it to Japan, the Shandong province, which is, you knew that it's totally angered China, the whole
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
So what is your comment on that?
Well, the Versailles Treaty was an absolute disaster. It was the last big flourish of European colonialism and imperialism. Obviously, they didn't consult China, because China was the next country. They were part of the world they were hoping to carve up. I mean, this is the time, as you know, when China was. I think it was Yuan Shikai was still the president of China, and anyway, the warlords, the British were basically running Yuan Shikai. They had Shanghai. They divided it up into the concessions that were there. The British had Hong Kong. So just giving bits of China to each other, because they didn't take the Chinese people seriously. I mean, as far as they were concerned, the Chinese were, just people like the Africans and the others, the Indians, who they should be colonized and ruled by the Europeans like everybody else. And the Europeans at that time took it absolutely for granted that they had the right to decide who governed which territory amongst themselves right across the world. I mean, it was not even something that in their arrogance they even considered that other nations had a word in. Now, the reason they gave it to Japan was because, of course, Britain had a strong alliance at that time with Japan. So the British thought of Japan not just as an ally, but almost as a kind of vassal state. This is, the British Empire, and Japan had joined the First World War against Germany. So this was going to be its reward. It was going to have, was it Tianjin and all of these places. So that was exactly how the Versailles Treaty was conducted. As I said, it's a world which has passed in terms of power, but not fully in terms of psychological understanding. The Europeans still think of themselves as superior to everyone else and still believe that they are the people who have the right ultimately to decide things for everyone else.
I think it's probably under Duan Qirui, but it's Yuan Shikai, Duan Qirui, the same group of people. But
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the thing though, China also fought in World War One. Both France and Britain, they used a lot of Chinese labor and recruited, and they went to Europe, and many of them died there fighting Germany. And so China was regarded as on the ally side, which is the winning side. And that's what angered China. And to this day, I think it's still a lot of people think this whole thing is such a humiliation that you are on the winning side, and this is how they treated you. So
well, exactly. I mean, they didn't take China seriously. And to this day, by the way, Westerners are unaware of the fact that China was fighting along in the First World War. They don't know about China's role in the Second World War either. I mean, as far as they're concerned, as I said, China at that time was a semi-colony, and that is all it was.
Yeah. And then also now, just so for people who are not familiar with that part of it, it actually is in this case the U.S. Warren Harding was the president of the United States. He's the one later. I mean, he's the one who had this Washington Naval Conference, right? Yeah. And in that conference, I think he mediated eventually when get Shandong province back to China, right? That's so. Right. So here, what credit should do is people probably should be fair. The U.S. at that time was playing a better role. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. There was a major, I mean, this is, of course, a previous period in American history. Now, the Americans were still going through the period of transition from the period when they were, a republic confined to North America. Then in the 1890s, they started to expand beyond North America. They basically took over Cuba. They occupied the Philippines and all of that. But there was still a strong sentiment in America that this wasn't really what America should be up to. And American policy in the 1920s was actually towards China was very proper. I mean, this is well, I would say very proper. That's probably an overstatement, actually. But certainly it was a lot better than that of the other Western powers. They didn't operate outright concessions in China. They had a different outlook, and they tended to be very critical of what the European powers were up to.
Yeah, actually, even the United States, Woodrow Wilson was, I think he, in the beginning, wanted to give Shandong back to China, but then he changed his tone. He wasn't too sure about that. But he didn't do anything until Warren Harding came in, and Harding decided, okay, give it back to China. I think that's what happened. So even the United States wasn't, always.
No. And as I say, it was changing. I mean, it hadn't become the outright imperial hegemon that it became yet. So as I said, it was still conflicted. This is the time, by the way, when this is an issue at the time that is close to my heart. This is the time when the great American jurists of that period in the 1920s who started to think of a new system of international law based on equality between nations and states, and they played an instrumental role in developing the system of international law that we have today. Now, of course, America has repudiated all of that, but to a great extent, it had an American foundation. But that
Well,
was the old America, not today's America.
even back then, I think if you look at Woodrow Wilson, I think his policy is also very conflicted in my view.
Yeah.
He's the one who established the Federal Reserve, which we know are a collective private banks. All right.
Yeah.
Even though he believes in like a socialist kind of equality kind of a thing, he was trying to establish the League of Nations, which is precursor for the United Nations. So it sounds like he liked this equality idea, but he's also giving the US financial rights to a bunch of private bankers. So you see, just that there, I find to me, it's a conflict. It's contradict each other for me.
Absolutely. Well, Woodrow Wilson is a very interesting man because he is, first of all, he was a committed racist, and I think this is something that one should not overlook, and it undoubtedly, to some extent, influenced his thinking. So he was very keen, basically, on self-determination and sovereignty amongst Europeans. He was never quite felt the same way about people who were not Europeans, because I think basically deep down he thought they were inferior, and though he was something of an anti-imperialist. Remember, he was a Southerner.
That's right.
Who lived through the Civil War in the United States, and whose family had passionately supported the Confederacy. So Woodrow Wilson wanted. I mean, he didn't want big powerful countries to dominate smaller ones, because he lived through that. But at the same time, he still had a sort of paternalist, racist view about things, and he was absolutely someone who had no fundamental problems with the business oligarchy as well. Now, he's a very complex figure, and his administration is a very complex one as well. And he left lots of things unfinished, and he had lots of interesting and good ideas, which were never really brought to fruition because of who he was.
Yeah, one thing he also did was introduce I think, income tax, which
That's
many
right.
people in the United States says it's illegal, it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
I leave that to the constitutional scholars, but there were people who think that's unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, Trump claimed that he wants to look into whether he could get rid of a federal tax or something like that. We will see, but there is an argument to be made that the whole federal income tax probably is problematic. I would think that.
Like yourself, I will leave that to the constitutional lawyers, of which I am not one, by the way. But I do know that argument gets thrown around. So who knows?
Yeah. And one more thing is there is also many people believe that if not for the Treaty of Versailles, China may never be a communist country. What do you think of that theory? So here's the reason I think people think that. One is you understand, the May 4th movement, right? Because
yes, absolutely.
the May 4th is entirely, I think, organic students, and then the whole country got involved because they were so angry with this treaty. And under that enormous pressure, the Chinese government refused to sign it. But in that movement, quite a few of the Chinese Communist Party leaders, they started their career there. So
that's right.
I think that's part of it. And the other thing is because they angered China so much, even though, it's the British who started the Opium War. But that was much more recent, like the Treaty of Versailles was 1919, right? So at that time, people were so angry that they never fully forgive the European powers for this, in particular France and Britain. And so when Soviet came, Soviet wasn't part of that. So that's why they emotionally feel more closer to Soviet. What's your point?
Well, indeed, I think that is absolutely true. And I seem to remember. I don't remember exactly all the details, but I remember the Soviets actually at that time when they came to power also said that they would give up whatever bases or whatever it
Mhm.
was that they still had in China. And I know that went down well with the Chinese people at that time. I think there is a lot of truth to this, that the behavior of the Western powers created enormous indignation in China. But I'm going to say something else here, and this is an area of Chinese history which I think Chinese people obviously know an awful lot better about than I do. But my own sense is that there had already been a great awakening within Chinese society,
Mhm.
going back even before. I mean, uh, I know you. I know his name is said differently in Chinese, but Sun Yat-sen
That's
had
his.
already, yes, exactly, had already become an enormously important figure in Chinese political life. He'd led the Republic, the Republican Revolution of 1911. He'd been pushed aside by Yuan Shikai and all those horrible people, to put it mildly, backed by the British. But I think that there was right across China um, already an upsurge of patriotism and of desire to make China again independent and free and to chart its new course. And I think that would have developed. That would have developed anyway. It's
Mhm.
just that in the middle of all of this, even as the Chinese people were awakening,
Mhm.
suddenly the Treaty of Versailles happens. And the Chinese people, as I say, in the middle of their awakening, are told, you're just people that we can parcel around, can hand over bits of your territory, and do all of those things. And well, um, we don't know what you think, but we don't frankly care, because you are a colonial people and you really don't count. So one can imagine that this provoked enormous anger. And yes, of course, there'd just been the Russian Revolution, and Lenin had a different, which he did. He had a very strong and very different perspective on these things, and he wrote previously what is still, in my opinion, the best book on imperialism. By the way, it's, in my opinion, his greatest scholarly work. So one can understand how all of these things came together in all sorts of ways. But again, to repeat, this is something that Chinese people understand and know about more deeply than I do.
And the Chinese people, the netizen conclusion is you simply have to be strong. If you're weak, you will be thrown around like that. It's true. In the Paris Peace Conference, China was not even I mean physically at the table, but not negotiational at the table. Not really. China was on the menu.
Yeah, yeah.
It's true back then, but it's today. Ukraine is simply not really a strong country and being thrown around. It just things hasn't changed much, has it?
No, it hasn't changed at all, not in any serious or significant way. This is absolutely true. But of course, again, I mean, Ukraine to a certain extent lent itself to this by agreeing to become a proxy
Yeah.
for the Western powers in a conflict against Russia. And that was a disaster for Ukraine, as they should have realized. Now, China was in a different position, because China had always been a strong, powerful, independent country for most of its history,
Mm.
until the Europeans came and started to bring it down in the way that they did. But of course, the Chinese are the netizens who say that you have to be strong are absolutely right. If you give your independence away, then people will take it,
Mhm.
as, by the way, the Russians discovered in the 1990s.
Mhm. At the same time, do you think the Philippines, for example, or the Taiwan province, I mean, do they learn from this? I doubt it. There will always be people within those places that they don't see this as a cautionary tale, is it?
Oh, no, well, absolutely not. Because, of course, within every colonial system, there are always collaborators. I
Yeah.
mean, the Chinese people remember that very well. Again, I mean, the man, again, I know is Chiang Kai-shek,
Check.
and the whole system that he created around him, and his wife, who, by the way, I remember very well. I mean, they're a good example of that, utterly corrupt, utterly owned by the Western powers. And they're not the only ones. There is always a class of people like that. And the point is that they are always out of, that they're not part of the sentiment of the nation. And they are frightened and hostile to the nation that they pretend to run. But there is always this it's called in the West a comprador elite. In other words, people whose loyalties are to the colonial power rather than to their own people, and who also, by the way, experienced disrespect from the colonialists, which they take out with anger against their own people.
Yeah. Okay, so Putin and Xi Jinping had a phone call. From the readout, you don't get a whole lot, but my feeling is he just briefing Xi Jinping of the latest activities between Russia and the United States, isn't it?
Exactly what he's doing. Now, can I just say, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but I strongly believe that Xi Jinping and Putin speak to each other very regularly. So it's the fact that we've now got readouts is not is interesting, because it means that the Russians and the Chinese want the world to know that Putin and Xi Jinping have spoken to each other. So what will have happened, and it's the Russian readout about this is absolutely clear. Putin briefed Xi Jinping about his conversation with Donald Trump and the discussions that are taking place with the Americans, and that's absolutely what he should do, because for the Russians, as they've made absolutely clear, the relationship with China remains central. I mean, it remains paramount. Whatever happens with the Americans, the relationship with China remains more important.
But people who somehow believe just the one meeting, Russia would just turn against China, I think we need to remember that Russia's relationship with the West, including the United States, has gone bad for a while. It's not just the Ukraine war, is it? There has been many years problems.
Well, that is absolutely true. And of course, the relationship with the United States might be slightly improving, but I mean, nothing of substance has yet been agreed. But the relationship with Europe, the European powers, remains terrible. In fact, arguably, over the last 2 weeks, it's got even worse because the Europeans are so angry about the fact that the Americans are talking to the Russians. But there is something else which, again, people do not understand. But I, who am, in contact with people in Russia, am very well aware of, which is it's not just that our relations with the Western powers are bad, so therefore we have to be friends with the Chinese. It's that we have worked with the Chinese, and we see that it is good for us. It works. We like it. We like having the Chinese people here. We like the business that they do. We like the fact that we are able to do business in their country. We're not going to sacrifice that.
Yeah, for example, I think one of the things that I read is Putin allows Western companies coming back to Russia. I mean, all these Western companies and I mean, all the overseas outsiders coming to Russia, they normally would have some local, collaborators. And for the locals, I mean, this is just not sustainable. Okay, one day you come in, you want to work with me, and then the next day you left, and now you come back. I just don't think it's very sustainable, these kind of a business relationship even.
No, it's not. It is absolutely not. And of course, again, people have noticed that there's been this talk about, because which comes basically from the Americans. The Americans want to lift sanctions because they want to go back into Russia. Russian society is not happy about this. Now, this is a fact that, again, isn't widely reported, but you've now had all kinds of businesses develop in Russia, which have taken the place of Western businesses. And they say, we don't want the Americans and the Europeans back. We don't want these awful people competing with these new companies that we are building. And in fact, there's been a whole series of statements from senior officials, including officials from the economics and industry ministries. I believe in Putin himself, though I haven't actually seen this, in which they say, look, even if sanctions are lifted, we are not going back to the pre-2022 model. We will continue to give the same levels of support to our domestic industries as we are doing now. We will continue to strategize and prioritize all of that. And, companies like Lada Cars, which Renault used to own, and Renault now say they want to come back. The management of Lada have said, we don't want you back. Stay away. So again, it's not been very well received there. This idea that the Russians are yearning for the Westerners to come back. Well, some people might, the people who want to buy Louis Vuitton bags and that kind of thing, which they can anyway, by the way. But those people, overall, Russian society isn't positive about this at all.
But the Westerns still don't get it. They still feel like we can do things whenever we want it and however we want it, to treat people so unfairly, so unequally, disrespectfully, but that's okay for them to do so, right? They still have that mentality.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And about Russia, I've never forgotten this. I went to a lecture by the great British historian A.J.P. Taylor, who was, by the way, something of a Russophile. And he said that when it comes to Russia, the West wants to treat Russia like a tap that he can turn on and off whenever it wants. And that's exactly right.
Yeah. One more thing that they did talk about is I guess they're going to doing a joint ceremony thing to commemorate the World War II. China calls it the resistance against the Japanese aggression. The Russians call it anti-fascist war. And so they're going to do 80 years. It's a big time, big occasion. And so I think they also, on top of both countries have sacrificed most. Those are the two countries sacrificed most in terms of the people died and injured in the two front, right? The two war fronts. But also, I think they also want to remind probably everybody, this is very devastating. Let's not forget, the danger of war, the devastation of the war. Is that some elements to that as well?
Absolutely, and this should not be underestimated at all. The commemorations in Moscow are going to be enormous on the 9th of May, and Xi Jinping is expected to come. And by the way, Lula of Brazil is going to be there, and Donald Trump is not coming, by the way, despite what people think. And the fact that Putin is going to go to China to attend the commemorations in China, that has been very widely reported in Russia, and is taken extremely seriously there. Now, the Russians are very focused on their own war, but you will find more knowledge in Russian society about China's war, much more than you will find in the West. I think it's fair to say that if you go out in Britain and you ask 100 Britons that you see on the street, which side was China on during the Second World War, it's unlikely anyone would know. It is that level of suppression. That wouldn't be true in Russia in any way, by the way. And that is an important difference. And you're quite right. For them, however you call it, the anti-imperialist or anti-fascist struggle or whatever it is, there is this sense that these two countries were the rock upon which the racist, genocidal imperialism that developed in the 1930s broke. So this is something that each of them takes great pride in and great comfort from the fact that the other commemorates.
I have this theory. I wonder whether, World War II is part of the reason that the Europeans hate Russia. You see, both Britain and France, they are mighty. They were mighty, right? They have their empire. They colonize everywhere in the world. But then they failed to protect their own homeland. They had to rely on the Soviets to save them. I think it must be embarrassing, don't you think?
It is absolutely embarrassing. And the Russians knew it would happen at the time, both before the First World War and during the Second World War. Various Russians said, if we're going to get into this war, which we might not be able to avoid, and we are victorious, the West will never forgive us. One of the people who said that was the Russian general, Marshal Zhukov, who was the most famous general. He said they will never forgive us for the fact that we won the war for them. Mm-hmm. And in Russia itself, equally famous. It was written just before the First World War by a very senior Russian official called Durnovo. He was, in fact, the Minister of the Interior. And he wrote a letter to the Tsar just before the First World War, in which he said, if there is a war between Germany and Russia, Russia will have to do all the heavy fighting. It will be a tremendous sacrifice for us. And in the case of Russia, it might even lead to disaster. Mm-hmm. But if we win, the British will not forgive us, and they will turn on us as soon as the Germans have lost. So there it is. You're quite right.
But I still don't understand Germany. I mean, Germany have so much to gain by having a good relationship with Russia. Why do they always turn on Russia, like a World War II, for example? I don't see why Hitler need to fight, the Soviet. They had a peace agreement, isn't it? A non-invasion or something agreement, but
yes,
Hitler broke that. So
yeah,
why is Germany always so much against Russia?
This is an excellent question. Now, I should say I know Germany very well. I mean, I've been there very, very often, and there's always this tension within German society, particularly between the Protestant Northeast and the Catholic Southwest. Now, the Protestant Northeast, the old Prussia, generally is quite open to good relations with Russia. And if you looked at the recent elections in Germany, you see that it's there that the AfD, which wants a reconciliation with Russia, is strongest. The Catholic Southwest is very, very hostile to Russia. They see it as inferior, they see it as barbarous, and they see it as a place that has lots of resources which Germany should have. Basically, it's as straightforward as that. And they don't like the Russians getting too powerful and too strong, and they see them as a kind of danger. So there's always been this tension within Germany, and sometimes, occasionally, when you get the Northeasterners exercising some level of control, when it was people like, for example, Willy Brandt, who was the chancellor in the 60s, who launched Ostpolitik, and he was from Berlin, which is east northeast, then you will start to get some kind of moves towards a rapprochement with Russia. But when it starts to be politicians from the West, they become much more hostile to it. In the case of the latest crisis, I have to say I was shocked by the extent to which Germany turned against Russia. I was completely unprepared for it. I thought that these two nations had to some extent put the conflicts of the past behind them. But what I now realize is that within this apparent working relationship that existed, there was this bubbling anger inside Germany that Russia wasn't doing what Germany wanted. That instead of simply being, the place that provided Germany with its gas and its mineral resources and all of those kind of things, Russia was starting to play a role again as not just a global power, but as a European power. And that was considered extremely threatening. Now, you asked about Hitler. Remember, Hitler came from the Catholic Southwest. He was an Austrian. So he had that animus towards Russia that I've spoken about.
This is so interesting because if you look at the surrounding countries surrounding China, it's very much like that. If you look at Korea, North Korea, closer to China, South Korea, not so. And if you look at Vietnam, northern Vietnamese are more friendly towards China versus the South. And then the Mongolia, the inner Mongolia, much more friendly. And then the outer Mongolia, it's it's the same.
There you go. Exactly the same. Yeah.
And the other thing, we're talking about Germany. So what's the election? What's your take on the German election? I mean, there's no surprise, right? It's pretty much what the opinion polls show that's pretty much the result. So moving forward, is there going to be any change in the German policy?
No, I don't think so. And I think this is incredibly sad, actually, because as I say, I know Germany quite well. My wife's family, on her mother's side, is German. I travel to Germany very often, and I can see a country that is going down. And it's going down because obviously it's quarreled with Russia, it's got involved in wars, in the war in Ukraine, but it's also quarreling with China also, which was its biggest trade partner. I mean, again, it's very difficult to explain to outsiders how important for Germany trade with China had become. I mean, people think of the car factories, for example, the fact that Germany was exporting cars to China. That was actually only part of it. I mean, a friend of my wife's owned a company that made mattresses, small business. But again, it was connected very much with China in all kinds of ways. I mean, they exported to China. They bought equipment from China. This lady would travel regularly there. So, and we now have a policy where Germany is turning against those countries, Russia and China, with which it needs to trade and with which it needs to be a friend. And it's realigning itself with an America because the Americans have this anti-Chinese obsession, which is not really sympathetic to Germany at all, and is threatening to impose sanctions on it, or rather tariffs on. And what the Germans think they're doing, I really cannot understand.
Now, in this election, actually, a little bit unusual is they openly, I mean, the U.S. openly supported the AfD, right? Vance, didn't he meet Alice Vidal instead of meeting Schultz?
That's right.
And also Elon Musk made it very clear he supports the AfD, right? So why is the U.S. so openly? I mean, U.S. always involved in other people's business. So that's not surprising. But why is this time so openly supporting the AfD?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think there are some ideological overlaps. I mean, one shouldn't take that too far, but there are some ideological overlaps as well. I think that there is a general perception within the Trump administration that an AfD-led Germany would be more friendly in the end to the United States and would open up the German economy further to American business, which is very important for Musk. I mean, Musk, remember, after all, he runs a car company, amongst a car manufacturing company, as much as everything else. And I think he wants to be involved in Germany and to open factories and do things there. And he finds that very difficult. So I think there may be an element. I think that's probably the element of it, yeah.
But it didn't work. I mean, the AfD did well, but still not enough to build a coalition government. Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, it did better than many people expected, but nowhere near enough to be able to form a government. We're going to get a government in Germany very similar to the one we've just had.
Mhm.
I mean, the former governing party, the SPD, are going to be part of the new governing coalition. So one can't expect any great change.
Well, my only hope is, please, no more Annalena Baerbock, please.
I think so. I think so.
Okay.
I think so, yeah.
The other thing is coming to Asia. Australia now recently have some dispute with China, which I
Yeah.
totally don't get. Okay, so Australia's complaint is that now the China send some ships supposedly close to Australian water, even though it is international water. But it was China's response to Australia's provocation. They sent a maritime patrol plane in the South China Sea, very close to China. Why do they do these kind of provocation thing? I thought when Albanese came to power, I thought he's trying to improve the relationship between the two. So what's going on here? And this is under Trump. This is not Biden. This is Trump. I must say, Trump must know this, or U.S. government must support this.
Oh, of course, but Trump is as anti-Chinese, or at least his administration is, as Biden's was. I mean, there are nuances and differences, and I think he will get on better with Xi Jinping, and there'll be, more pleasantries, and they might even manage to do some business together. But American attitudes towards China have not changed. They remain as obsessed with China as ever. In fact, as I said previously, everything now in America is based around China. And they still want their allies in the Pacific to be as anti-Chinese as possible. So America has huge influence in Australia, and it's been working the influence that it has, and it wants the Australians to act in this very provocative way. And of course, the Australian attitude is, don't do to us what we do to you. It's fine for our ships to move around your waters as close as possible to your ports, but under no circumstances must you do that to us. I mean, we are the good people, you're the bad people. If we do it to you, it's good. If you do it to us, it's aggression. I mean, that is the Western attitude.
And they were surprised. I guess the thing is that they didn't expect China to react so strongly. I think that's what caught them off guard, right?
I have never understood this, by the way. I mean, here, this is something I've been aware about China. I mean, you talked about how netizens say that in order to avoid sacrificing your independence, China, any country needs to be strong.
Yeah.
And this has been a theme for me with China for as long as I can remember. It was like this in Mao Zedong's time.
Yeah.
I mean, the Chinese were very strong. They defended themselves very, very toughly because they understood very well that if they didn't, the West would walk all over them. Yeah. So why do people get surprised still when the Chinese respond toughly? I would have thought by now people would know that if you do this, you will get a tough response back.
Yeah, yes, I think they should know by now. But in the past, whenever they did this, China just sending their own fighter jets and then get rid of them, pull them out of, further out. But this time actually went too close, in their view, too close to Australia, the home.
Well, I understand that, and maybe it's better that didn't happen. But in that case, why get so close to China? Why assume that the Chinese won't respond to what you're doing, won't respond in kind? Again, we talk about sanctions. Why assume that if you sanction China won't sanction you back? I remember some years ago when the Chinese imposed sanctions on some British journalists and MPs who'd been going around saying awful things about China, actually, and supporting awful people in China. But that's another story. Anyway, I remember when that happened, the outrage and the horror and the fury that this happened. And of course, the British are very happy to sanction people all over the place. But the idea that it could be done to them, that was just it's superiority, our sense of superiority, our arrogance, all of that.
I think until this attitude, the Western, this kind of arrogance attitude changes, I find it's very hard to conduct business, with the West in general. I think it will be still moving forward, will be hard, continue to be hard, I think.
I'd put it even more strongly. Until this attitude changes, the world will not know peace.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Because lots of times they do things simply because they can. They thought that they can, not because they think this is right, or even in some incidents it's truly beneficial for them. But they just thought, why not? Why don't we just, do this and do that? Yeah, that's the attitude problem. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's exactly the attitude problem.
Yeah. And Israel, talking about attitude problem, people don't even pay much attention. But Israel now officially declares that they're expanding their operation across the entire district of Jenin, which is West Bank. So are they going to take at least part of the West Bank now?
Yes, I think very likely. I think that my own personal view about Israel is that it is now programmed, the Israeli government and political system is now programmed to try to achieve the Greater Israel Project, which basically means to take over direct control of all territories within the former British Mandate of Palestine. In other words, to not allow no room for the Palestinians at all.
Well, what is the role? From the Palestinian side? What is the role, the function of Fatah? I don't hear much about them.
They don't do very much at all. This is the major reason why Hamas emerged so strong in Gaza, because most Palestinians in Gaza felt that Fatah was not protecting the Palestinian rights, and the same will happen eventually in the West Bank as well. I mean, you'll see a radicalization begin to take hold there as people resist, the attempts of the Israelis to extend their control into the West Bank as well.
You see, that's how the Chinese netizens comments is like, when you have an organization like Fatah, I find the Fatah always giving in, right? That Israel's demand, that they always trying to somehow giving in, and they believe they could get peace. They will never.
Well, they'll never get peace. I mean, we were talking about, elites in colonies that have become corrupted and have been taken over and are basically run by the colonial master. I'm not saying that Fatah is entirely like that, but it has a lot of that quality about it now.
And Trump's policy is what? No policy there, just let Netanyahu to do whatever he wants? Because clearly his idea to clean up move all the Palestinian there is not going to work, right? And so Israel just continue to do whatever it wants.
He has absolutely no policy at all, except that he wants Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations, which the Saudis have said they're not going to agree to. Why he thinks that a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel is going to change anything, I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, very sad, but we will continue to see, Israel to take more territories and killing more people. So
yes.
But what about the Arab countries? So if Israel's goal is to create this great Israel, which everybody can see, what are they going to do? Are they going to let Israel to do this, or are they going to react in some fashion?
I think the Arab states are so corrupted and so inefficient and so weak that they will probably just not react. But eventually, because I understand the anger amongst the Arabs is growing all the time, I mean, there will be a crisis. And this is why the Arab states, by the way, are so tense. Why, we could justifiably talk about dictatorships here, because the Arab states themselves, the leaders, understand that they are not really representing their people anymore and haven't done so for a very, very long time. So this is where the tension is.
Okay. That's all I have for now. Let's talk next Wednesday once again.
Well, indeed. We'll have lots to. We will have lots to see, and I predict, by the way, that Lavrov, as you probably know, has already met with Wang Yi,
Uh-huh.
and there was this telephone call between Xi Jinping and Putin.
Hmm.
I think we're going to see an awful lot more Chinese Russian contacts
Hmm.
within the next few weeks, because the Russians will most definitely want to make sure that the Chinese know exactly what's going on.
Hmm.
I have to say this: the fact that Putin, apparently, it was Putin who who decided to
Hmm.
make the call, and that he went out of his way to brief Xi Jinping
Hmm.
and to get the Chinese to say that they support the moves towards normalization between America and Russia is very, very important for the Russians. As I said,
Yeah.
it's not a relationship, the one with China, that they want to jeopardize in any way. So I think we'll be seeing quite a lot there.
And I forgot one thing is that I think the New York Times reported, not many people paid attention, that apparently there has already been some contact between the US and the United States, I mean, US and China. And apparently Trump had some proposal to China, which want China, on the surface, it sounds reasonable, want China to buy more US goods and invest more in the United States. But based on, we don't know the detail. Okay, we don't know exactly
No.
what they said. But based on China's reaction to it, because the China's foreign
Mm.
ministry spokesperson said, we want our sovereignty. We also want to protect our industry, stuff like
Yeah,
that. It sounds like what he's asking is tremendous amount of investment and tremendous amount of purchasing the US goods or something
that's right.
to the
That's
degree
right.
that is unreasonable. I think
Absolutely.
that's what,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, what basically Trump wants is he wants the Chinese to buy peace, which they're not going to do. I mean, why would they? I mean, this is Trump. Trump thinks that he can, you know, force people to do this, and if he's threatening enough, that they will all come to his rescue. It doesn't work like that, and it's such a complete misjudgment, misunderstanding of what China is.
Mhm.
And I mean, it so completely misunderstands recent Chinese history, or the attitudes of the Chinese people.
And I think
Anyway, there we go.
and his negotiation with Russia is not as easy as he thought
No,
would be, and even Zelensky is resisting, at least so far, to
yeah.
to just sign, whatever they ask him to sign. So, in the foreign policy front, I don't think he is going through very smoothly.
No, he isn't, because he doesn't act. I mean, he doesn't. It's something that we pointed out in previous programs. He approaches negotiations like a real estate
Yeah.
dealer,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
diplomacy is quite different. I
Different.
mean,
Hmm.
diplomacy requires patience and very hard work and attention to detail, and finding where the points of agreement are and trying to build on them over time and achieving trust. Trump doesn't work like that. He comes in, comes in all guns blazing. He thinks he can intimidate and bully people, and they'll come running to him. And of course, they don't, because that's not how diplomacy works. Certainly, it isn't how it works with China.
Hmm. Hmm.
Remember what I said before, and this is, my first rule of diplomacy: don't try to bluff China, because
Hmm.
your bluff is always called.
Hmm. His only success is, seems to me, is with the Europeans. He got the
Yeah,
Europeans to panic.
that's right. That's right. Which is no bad thing, by the way.
Okay. All right. Talk to you next
Speak,
Wednesday. Thank you so much.
absolutely. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.